Some moments change everything. One choice, one outstretched hand, and life takes a turn you never expected. 3 years ago, on a cold October day, Marina met two boys who had lost everything. She could have walked away, but she didn't. And that decision reshaped all their lives forever. This is a story of love, courage, and the unexpected ways fate leads us home. The October wind toyed with the fallen leaves, twisting them into small whirlwinds at the feet of passers-by. The sky, veiled in dense gray clouds, cast a somber gloom over the city. Marina pulled up the hood of her cloak and quickened her pace. The Sunday market would close in an hour, and she still had to make it in time. Buying fruits, vegetables, and herbs for the week was a small ritual she had maintained since the days of cooking for two. Yet, as she walked, her mind reeled with fragments of an unfinished business report due on Monday, a data check for a client, a call to her mother. Her fingers clenched a shopping list stuffed in her pocket, hastily scribbled on the back of an old receipt. Another day blending seamlessly into the monotonous rhythm of duty-bound weekdays and weekends, marked more by necessity than joy. Near the entrance of the market, a crowd had gathered, some carefully bagging the last of the season's apples, others haggling over fresh fish, while vendors hastily packed up their stalls. Amidst the chaos of sounds and scents, Marina felt like just another part of the city's relentless motion, where everyone seemed to be chasing happiness without realizing how elusive it truly was. Suddenly, a faint tug at her sleeve, so light it could have been dismissed as an accidental brush in the crowd. Yet, Marina turned and froze. Before her stood a boy. For a fleeting second, all she registered were his eyes, gray as a foreboding sky, far too solemn for a child's face. Eyes that belonged not to an 8-year-old, but to someone who had already endured a lifetime of hardship. Then, she took in the rest of him, a thin jacket, clearly borrowed from someone bigger, frayed jeans sagging at the knees, tousled blonde hair. But in her mind, only his eyes remained, locked in a quiet, unwavering determination. "You can help," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft but firm. Only then did Marina notice the bundle in his arms, a tattered, once white blanket, out of which peeked a tiny face. Pink cheeks stood in stark contrast to the pallor of the older child. A little nose twitched in sleep. Questions swirled in her mind. Where were their parents? Why were they alone? Had their mother left briefly? Would she return? But before she could voice a single thought, the boy met her gaze directly, measuring every word before he spoke. "Auntie," he said, "do you need a baby?" She felt the world tilt. "Take my brother," he continued. "He's 5 months old, and he's very hungry." The words struck harder than any blow. For a moment, reality itself seemed to shift, as though the fabric of the world had been torn. Marina looked around at the passers-by, who flowed past them like a river around a lone, unyielding stone. Some glanced away. Others didn't even notice the two unaccompanied children standing there. "Mom left a few days ago," the boy murmured. "She said she'd be back soon, but—" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "We have nothing to eat. Temka cries all the time." "And your father? Grandparents?" Marina asked, though she feared the answer. The boy shook his head. "No." A pause. "Only Aunt Lita from the next apartment. Sometimes she helps. But she's in the hospital now." A faint whimper broke the silence. The baby stirred, his tiny hands slipping from the blanket, his cries growing louder. Instantly, the boy, Dima, began to rock him with awkward, practiced motions, shifting from side to side. "This is Artyom," he said, still fixated on his brother. "He's good. He doesn't cry much. Only when he's hungry." His voice carried a weight far beyond his years, an unchildlike concern that made something in Marina's chest tighten painfully. She looked at him, the boy who had taken on an impossible burden, who had become the sole protector of a helpless infant. "I'm afraid they'll take us away," Dima whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. "And then we'll never see each other again." Artyom's cries intensified, his tiny fists flailing, his skin flushing a deep crimson. "He's hungry." Dima's gray eyes flashed with fear. "I tried to give him milk, but it went sour. And there's no more money." Time seemed to halt. Marina could see it now. The baby truly was hungry. She reached out, first to Artyom's tiny stomach, then extended her hands toward Dima. "May I hold Artyom?" she asked softly. I'll feed him, keep you both warm at my place, and then we'll figure out what happened to your mother." Dima hesitated, studying Marina as if trying to see through her intentions. Then, after a moment's pause, he nodded and carefully handed over the bundle. The warmth of the infant's small body in her arms sent a sharp, unfamiliar pang through her chest. The baby squinted at her unfamiliar face, then let out a soft, almost reluctant sigh before settling again. "I'll buy formula and a bottle," Marina said, rising to her feet. "And at home, there's soup and goulash for you, Dima. After that, we'll decide what to do next." A flicker of something, tentative, fragile hope, crossed Dima's eyes, as subtle as the first thin layer of ice forming over puddles on a cold November morning. Together, they moved through the bustling crowd. Marina's thoughts shifted between uncertainty. What am I doing? How can I walk away from them? And a quiet resolve. From the depths of her memory, long-buried dreams of motherhood resurfaced, only to be quickly pushed aside. This wasn't the time for self-reflection. She glanced down at Dima, who clung tightly to the edge of her cloak. There was a resilience in him, the kind forged only in those who had learned too early the ache of loss. He reminded her of herself, when she, too, had been forced to navigate a world unraveling around her, moving forward because there was no other choice. "Everything will be all right," she murmured, though it was more for herself than for him. Dima said nothing, only tightened his grip on her cloak. The wind picked up, carrying the first drops of rain. That evening, once the children had eaten, Marina carefully laid Artyom in an improvised crib, a large box lined with a soft plaid blanket and a hastily bought diaper. She sat on the edge of the couch, exhaustion weighing on her body. Across from her, Dima remained in an armchair. She had offered him a room, but he had refused. "I need to stay near Tima," he said with the quiet stubbornness of a little sentinel who could not abandon his post. In the silence of the apartment, the past surged forward, unbidden, like a storm tide crashing over everything that had once seemed immovable. "You're the most beautiful bride in the world," Andre had whispered, twirling her around on the deserted river embankment after their wedding. The golden September sunlight shimmered on the water, breaking into thousands of scattered reflections. Marina had laughed, tilting her head back, her veil billowing behind her like a weightless cloud. She had felt as if she were floating, feet barely touching the ground. The wedding had been modest, not out of frugality, but by choice. Neither of them had wanted ostentatious luxury or a room filled with indifferent guests invited merely for formality's sake. At first, Andrei's mother, Elena Viktorovna, had pursed her lips in disapproval. "We wouldn't want to offend anyone," she had said. But later, even she admitted that the intimacy of the ceremony had created a rare and special sense of family closeness. Before leaving that evening, she had embraced Marina. "Daughter," she had murmured warmly, "I'm so glad Andryasha has you now. A woman's heart knows when something is meant to be." Elena Viktorovna, a petite, poised woman with a piercing gaze and impeccable manners, had always inspired in Marina a blend of admiration and awe. As the head of a cardiology department, she was accustomed to making life-or-death decisions, always exuding an air of unwavering control. Her perfect posture, minimal jewelry, and meticulously styled hair spoke of discipline and self-restraint. Andrei's father, Viktor Mihailovich, was her complete opposite. A professor of history and a renowned scholar far beyond their country's borders, he was perpetually absent-minded, with unruly gray hair and glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He carried the distracted air of a man far more captivated by the mysteries of the past than by the trivialities of daily life. As a child, I read a story about a girl from an ordinary family who married a prince. In that tale, the curse cast upon them seemed the only real threat. Who could have known that, in her own life, the spell would be broken not by magic, but by something far more mundane? The first 2 years of marriage dissolved in her memory like sugar in hot tea, sweet, seamless, leaving no trace behind. Andrei was a promising young architect, still at the beginning of his career yet already decorated with prestigious awards. He carried her in his arms, both literally and figuratively, bringing her breakfast in bed on Sunday mornings, surprising her with concert tickets or impromptu weekend getaways to small seaside towns. "My muse," he would murmur into her hair, breathing in its scent as if trying to capture it forever. "What a blessing it is to have you." In their bright apartment, with its large windows and bookshelves lining the walls, he would often imagine their future children. "They'll have your eyes," he would say, tracing his finger along her temple. "Those big, brown ones with flecks of gold that appear when you laugh." Then, smiling, he would add, "And your stubborn chin. Though, I fear that stubbornness is the inevitable inheritance of an architect's child." At first, they weren't concerned that pregnancy hadn't come. They were young, with their whole lives ahead of them. Elena Viktorovna, Andrei's mother, would sometimes glance at Marina's stomach when she visited, but never asked direct questions. Her tact was one of the qualities Marina admired most about her. But by the end of their second year, something began to shift. Marina couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the first hairline fracture appeared, but soon, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Andrei started coming home later. At dinner, he sat in silence, lost in thought. He avoided discussing the future. Sometimes, she would catch him studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Is everything okay?" she asked. His response was always the same, a distracted rub of the bridge of his nose, a sigh. "The project is complicated. The client keeps changing the requirements." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. Until one night, as spring rain drummed against the eaves, her world collapsed. "We've been married for 2 years, Andrei said, his voice devoid of warmth. 2 years, and still no child." She met his gaze and, for the first time, saw something foreign in his eyes. "Is it true?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Did you have an abortion?" The words struck harder than a slap. At first, she thought she had misheard. "What?" Her voice was hoarse. "Don't pretend," he said coldly. "I know. Someone told me." A wave of ice crept from her fingertips to her heart. Who could have said such a thing? It didn't matter. "What matters," he continued, turning away, his fists clenched, "is that you lied to me. You told me I was your first." "Andrei, please," she pleaded, grasping his arm, searching his face. "You were my first. I've never had an abortion. I swear, it's a lie." "Then why can't you get pregnant?" He turned back, and in his eyes, she saw a raw mixture of pain and anger. She took a step back. "My mother says it happens after abortions," he added, his voice like acid. "Especially if they weren't done professionally. Infertility is a common consequence." "Your mother," she choked out. You discussed this with your mother?" He shrugged, an indifferent gesture that hurt more than any of his words. "She spoke to a doctor," he said. "And it's clear to her that you're in no hurry to give her grandchildren. There's a scandal." She refused to undergo any examination, insisting that she was the daughter of a schoolteacher, raised with discipline, and that fidelity and honesty were not mere words to her. "Maybe it's not me," she cried in desperation. "Maybe it's you." She regretted the words the moment they left her lips. Andrei's face turned pale, rigid like a plaster mask. He turned away and slammed the door so hard that the glass in the picture frames trembled. Marina spent a sleepless night curled up on their wide bed. In the morning, Andrei returned, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he murmured, sitting on the edge of the bed, avoiding her gaze. "I shouldn't have done that. Nerves, work, stress." They embraced, and she felt the tension leave his body, but something had fractured between them, an invisible wall through which they now had to shout to be heard. A week later, they sat in a gynecologist's office. The doctor, an older woman with weary eyes, regarded them with quiet sympathy. "You have a hormonal imbalance and chronic inflammation," she said, studying the test results. "Likely the aftermath of an untreated infection from adolescence." Marina shook her head. At 16, she had fallen seriously ill with a high fever, but her mother, always working 2 jobs, never took her to a doctor, only offering hurried reassurances before rushing off to her evening shift. "Can it be treated?" Andrei's voice was tight with tension. The doctor hesitated, then shook her head. "Not entirely. We can try ovulation stimulation. There are modern methods, but I would also advise considering adoption. It's a noble choice, and many children are waiting for loving parents." The drive home was steeped in silence. Marina stole glances at Andrei's profile, his sharp features, the tight line of his lips, the furrow between his brows. She knew that for him, the only son of a family of hereditary intellectuals, Continuing the bloodline was not just a wish, but an expectation. She reached for his hand as they neared their apartment. "I'll go through all the treatments. We can have children." He nodded, but she saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. Thus began the grueling medical ordeal: hormone therapy, injections, endless pills, special diets. Marina's body became a battlefield where foreign forces waged war every month. Hope followed by crushing disappointment. Hot tears muffled in a pillow so Auntie wouldn't hear. And yet, he was slipping away. He stayed late at work, spent weekends at his parents' house, alone. 6 months later, when he came home reeking of wine and another woman's perfume, Marina was waiting in the darkened kitchen, a cup of long cold tea before her. "I've met someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're working on a project together. She's pregnant." The words felt like shards of glass on her lips. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I can't spend years waiting for a miracle. I'm 29. I should already be a father." The weight she had carried for so long suddenly lifted. The exhausting fight, for his love, for his family's approval, for the right to be enough, was over. "Then leave," she said quietly, without tears. The divorce was swift and almost painless, at least in the legal sense. Auntie was generous. He left her most of the furniture and half of the money from their joint account, moved in with his parents, and, as she later heard, bought an apartment in a new neighborhood for his new family. The pain came later, once the euphoria of liberation had faded. She would wake up at night, gasping under the weight of guilt. Maybe she hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe she should have been more patient with his needs, his desires. Then came the emptiness. Marina moved into a modest 2-room apartment in the old district, where she had spent her childhood. Her mother had passed away long ago, and she had never known her father or any other relatives. Her job as an editor at a publishing house was enough to cover her rent and expenses. One day, she ran into her former mother-in-law at the store, but the woman barely acknowledged her, offering only a cold stare before walking away. It was then, at 30 years old, that Marina truly grasped the depth of her loneliness. Friends with families of their own visited less frequently. Colleagues kept their conversations at work polite yet distant, and every evening, she returned to an empty apartment where silence wrapped around her like a second skin. Then, unexpectedly, a thought took root. While browsing the news online, she stumbled upon an article about adoption. She recalled the words of that weary doctor: "Many children are waiting for loving parents." Marina began researching adoption procedures, studying the requirements and reading stories from those who had already opened their homes to children not their own. "If I can't give birth, I will adopt," she decided. The thought crystallized into a plan, giving her a newfound sense of purpose. She took on extra freelance projects, working late into the night, determined to save enough money to make adoption a reality. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. As a single woman without a husband, the adoption committee could find countless reasons to reject her. But for the first time in a long while, her eyes held a spark of hope. What she didn't know was that fate, which had once treated her so cruelly, was preparing an unexpected encounter, one that would change everything. It happened at the Saturday market, where 2 little boys would turn her life upside down. That night, as the city's lights cast restless shadows across her apartment, Marina woke several times to Artem's cries, piercing, desperate wails that seemed to come from a place far beyond his small body. A cry born of hunger, of abandonment, of a world that had been unkind too soon. Each time, Marina got up, warmed the formula she had bought, changed his diapers, and whispered soft, meaningless reassurances, words that held no promises, because she had no way of knowing what tomorrow would bring. In the fragile hour between night and dawn, when reality wavers like a dream, she noticed Dima sitting stiffly in his chair, eyes wide, staring into the void. "You should rest," she said gently, sitting beside him and touching his shoulder. He flinched, tense as a wild creature and used to human kindness, his expression a mixture of weariness and desperate hope. "If Mama comes back and we're not there," his voice trailed off. Marina squeezed his thin shoulder lightly, feeling the sharp bones beneath his skin. "We'll go to your place in the morning," she promised. "Right after breakfast. We'll sort everything out." Dima nodded. Then, in an instant, He pressed himself against her, so briefly that she barely had time to feel his warmth before he pulled away again, curling up on the chair with his knees tucked under his chin. The next morning, breakfast was quiet. Marina made omelets and buckwheat porridge with pumpkin, slicing fresh fruit for the boys. Dima ate slowly, as if trying to make the meal last. With an unusual politeness, he carefully turned the spoon over, ensuring not a single drop was left behind. Marina observed him from beneath her lashes, taking in the details, the nails bitten down to the quick, the faint dirt marks on his elbows, the fragile frame etched with the hardships of a life spent on the very edge of survival. Artyom, having been fed formula, was sleeping soundly. Sniffles? Marina asked when Dima pushed away the empty plate. The boy nodded silently, his eyes flickering with something rare in children, a quiet, weary understanding. The kind that comes from knowing miracles don't happen, that every shelter has an expiration date, and that sooner or later, one must return to the place they came from. Marina had only caught fleeting glimpses of that neighborhood before, driving past its outskirts. Rows of five-story buildings stood in bleak uniformity, their facades dull despite hasty coats of paint. Benches lay broken at the entrances, and the ground, though the sky was clear, remained damp with a moisture that never seemed to dry, soaked in a kind of hopelessness. There, Dima pointed toward the third entrance, his small hand trembling slightly in Marina's palm. A suffocating blend of tobacco, urine, and stale alcohol greeted them as they stepped inside. Cigarette butts and husks from sunflower seeds littered the stairs, while a broken baby carriage with a missing bottom lay abandoned in the stairwell. Artyom whimpered softly in Marina's arms, but quickly fell silent, as if instinctively understanding that here, silence was necessary. Dima's voice grew quieter with each step up. The door to the apartment was ajar, a simple wooden door with peeling paint and a dent at knee level. From the narrow gap, a sour, musty scent seeped out, mingling with the unmistakable smell of damp laundry left too long in the rain and forgotten in the sun. "Mom?" Dima pushed his head through the crack, his voice subtly shifting, becoming smaller, more pleading, carrying a trace of guilt, as though he were apologizing for something he hadn't done. A hoarse cough answered from within, followed by the dull thud of something falling to the floor. Dima turned to glance at Marina, his face tense, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. "She's home," he said quietly. In those two words, there was such an air of resignation that Marina involuntarily stepped back. But then, gathering herself, she pushed the door open with quiet resolve. What she saw did not surprise her, not after Dima's stories, not after the state of the building. But knowing and seeing were two different things. The only light bulb overhead had long since burnt out, leaving the space in a dim, sickly half-light. Empty bottles cluttered the floor. Crumpled snack wrappers lay scattered among mismatched children's shoes. The air was thick, humid, sour, tainted with the stale scent of uneaten food and alcohol. A cockroach scurried along the wall, pausing briefly as if acknowledging the newcomers before continuing on its way. "Come in," Dima murmured, stepping forward like a guide leading a traveler through hostile terrain. The kitchen, in contrast, was unexpectedly bright. A single, naked light bulb illuminated every stark detail, the crusted remnants on unwashed plates, the 3-liter jar on the table, filled a quarter of the way with cigarette butts floating in murky liquid. At the table sat a woman. Marina's mind initially refused to believe that this was the boy's mother. She looked far older than her years, her limp, unkempt hair, a murky shade of russet, clinging to her gaunt face in greasy strands. Her features were sharp, her eyes bloodshot, her skin a sickly hue, mottled with red patches as if someone had carelessly brushed watercolors across it. The woman wore a greasy robe, beneath which a once white t-shirt was visible. She looked up, her cloudy eyes suddenly sharpening. "Where the hell have you been, you little brat?" Her voice was hoarse but unexpectedly loud, making even Marina flinch. Dima instinctively took a step back, pressing himself against Marina, trying to shield Artyom, who rested in her arms. He started, but the woman had already shifted her gaze to Marina. "And who the hell is she?" She attempted to stand but swayed, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "From child services or something?" Marina instinctively tightened her hold on Artyom, a wave of indignation rising within her. This woman, their mother, the one who had given them life, was now nothing more than a crumbling shell of a human being. Her condition evoked not just revulsion but a deep, unsettling fear of how far a person could truly fall. "No," Marina said, striving to keep her voice steady. "I found your children yesterday. They were alone. The baby could have died without care." The woman narrowed her eyes, a slight glint flashing across them before she suddenly let out a laugh, more of a dry, hacking cough than true amusement. "And now you're going to lecture me?" she sneered. "You realize they could take my kids away, don't you?" Marina felt her control slipping. Her voice wavered. The woman waved a dismissive hand and nearly toppled over. "Do you have any idea how many kids like them are out there? Too many. No one wants them. Let them take them. Let them." She reached for a bottle on the table, pouring its contents into a chipped glass. Her hand trembled visibly. Marina stood frozen, struggling to comprehend how these children had survived in this abyss of neglect. She pictured Dima, just 8 years old, caring for an infant, scavenging for food, protecting his little brother from their mother's drunken outbursts. Then, suddenly, Svetlana, if Dima was to be believed, that was her name, looked up, her gaze unexpectedly lucid. Something sharp and calculating flickered in her eyes. "So, what are you doing here, dressed like that?" Her eyes swept over Marina's simple but well-kept clothing, the leather boots, the bag slung over her shoulder. And then, in a voice unnervingly matter-of-fact, she said, "Maybe you'd like to buy him." Marina's breath caught. Dima stiffened beside her. "His name is Artyom," he murmured, barely above a whisper. But his mother paid no attention. "I'm serious," she continued, her voice taking on a chillingly businesslike tone, so out of place in the midst of such squalor. "He still cries at night. I have no milk left. He needs formula, clothes. There's an apartment nearby. Take him. I'll give him to you for cheap." A wave of horror, fury, and disbelief crashed over Marina, leaving her momentarily breathless. This woman, who had given life to 2 beautiful children, was offering to sell her own son like a discarded possession. "Are you out of your mind?" Marina's voice trembled with rage. "That's your child, your own flesh and blood." Svetlana only shrugged and downed her drink. "So what?" she said, her tone empty, indifferent. "I can't feed him anyway. If the guardianship authorities took him away, he would end up in a state home, and then, who knows what could be worse? And you're a woman. You seem normal. Not a drug addict, not an alcoholic." Svetlana let out a hoarse, humorless laugh. "I'm trying to save his life," she added. At that moment, Marina fully grasped the depths to which a person could fall, so far that even the most primal maternal instinct, the most ancient of human drives, had vanished without a trace. She glanced at Dima, who stood silently beside her, and in his eyes, she saw a strange mixture of shame and resignation. The child was more ashamed of his mother than she was of herself. Different options flashed through Marina's mind: calling the police immediately, taking the children by force, but she knew that any impulsive action would only complicate things. Child services had their own rules. Before the children could even have a chance to be in her care, if that was even possible, they would have to go through a system that might separate them forever. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'll come back in 2 days. I'll bring the money. But you must be ready to sign an official waiver, an affidavit relinquishing your rights," Marina said firmly. Svetlana perked up at once. Like a predator sensing prey, she leaned forward, a greedy spark igniting in her eyes. 10,000, she rasped, testing the waters. 5, Marina countered sharply, naming the amount she had in her wallet, plus what she had set aside for the children's needs. "I can give you a deposit now." Svetlana hesitated, torn between greed and reality. 10, she repeated, but without much conviction. 5, Marina said again, unwavering. "And I won't go to the police about your children being left unattended." It was a blatant lie. She knew she would have to report it, but Svetlana seemed to believe her. "Fine," the woman relented with a careless wave of her hand. "Let me write something down." Marina pulled a small notebook and pen from her bag, items she always carried. Svetlana scrawled a few uneven lines, a crude receipt for the money and a vague promise to sign official documents relinquishing parental rights. Marina doubted its legal weight, but that didn't matter now. She took out the cash and placed it on the table. Raking in the banknotes, Svetlana smirked. Just make sure you bring more. And don't try to cheat me. I'm a mother, after all. I can always change my mind. Marina's stomach churned with disgust. This woman, this so-called mother, was using her own child as a bargaining chip. I'll take care of your brother, Dima said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. He cast an uncertain glance at his mother, as if waiting for her to protest. But Svetlana merely waved him off. Go on, then. One less mouth to feed. Dima turned and disappeared into the depths of the apartment. His sweaty backpack clattered softly. Marina guessed it was filled with the last remnants of their childhood, perhaps a few battered toys for his brother. We're leaving, Marina murmured, more to herself than to Svetlana, who had already lost interest, her focus shifting back to the bottle. As they stepped out of the apartment, Dima carefully closed the door behind him. Marina noticed the way his fingers trembled, and in that moment, she realized even this place, this den of despair, was still his home. He'll be all right, she said, gripping Dima's hand tightly as they descended the stairs. I promise you. The boy nodded but remained silent. His eyes were cold, frozen with the expression of someone who had long stopped believing in the promises of adults. Someone who knew that kindness was always temporary, that every good thing had a price and an expiration date. With Artyom in her arms and Dima pressed against her side, Marina inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. It felt like salvation after the suffocating stench of that apartment. But inside, a storm raged. Her thoughts were tangled, her heart pounded. She had made a deal with a woman who had lost all traces of humanity. And now, she had to go to the police. What was she to do with Dima, a boy who feared separation from his brother more than anything in the world? Reason dictated one course of action, but her heart. Marina vividly remembered the loneliness that engulfed her after her husband left, the emptiness of her apartment, the deafening silence. She recalled the promise she had made to herself. If she couldn't have children of her own, she would adopt. And now, she stood at the precipice of a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Artyom's small, warm body nestled against her in sleep, while Dima's frail hand rested in hers. Both felt like delicate bridges to another world, a world where she could finally be whole again. Let's go home, she said. The word home rolled off her tongue so naturally that it startled her, as if this had been meant to be from the very beginning. The night stretched on like a rusted spring, groaning under the weight of sleepless minutes. The clock on the wall marked time with merciless precision, and Marina sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold. The children were asleep, Artyom tucked into a repurposed box, carefully transformed into a cradle, and Dima curled up on the couch, making himself as small as possible, as if trying not to be a burden. Svetlana's gaunt, sallow face hovered in Marina's mind, a face where motherhood had left only the faintest imprint, like an old stain that could never be scrubbed away. Every deep line told a story of surrender, to something stronger than duty, more overpowering than instinct. How could a mother sell her own child? The question echoed through her mind without an answer, yet beneath her moral outrage, another thought pulsed, one she dared not name. Am I any better? Am I not exploiting this situation to gain what nature denied me? Her thoughts spun in circles, dragging her into a whirlpool of doubt. Calling the police would set in motion a system she had no control over, placing the children's fate in the hands of bureaucrats who had no regard for human bonds. Not calling meant becoming an accomplice to a crime. Buying a child, even under the guise of charity, was illegal. And what guarantee was there that Svetlana, having tasted easy money, wouldn't come back to blackmail her later? Somewhere near dawn, as the darkness outside began to dissolve into pale morning light, Marina made her decision. What that decision was, even she wasn't entirely sure. She reached out and touched Dima's shoulder. We need to talk. His eyes snapped open instantly, absent of the sleepy tenderness most children had upon waking. He was alert, wary, ready for anything. We're going back? His voice carried the weight of resignation, but no surprise. He had been expecting this. All good things come to an end. All kind adults eventually disappear. He knew this as a certainty. Marina sat beside him, careful not to loom over him. I can't not report this to the police, Dima, she said, her voice unsteady. What she did to you, it's wrong. But she's still your mother. She needs help. She needs treatment. Dima's expression hardened, like a thin layer of ice sealing over water. They'll take Tima away, he whispered. And they'll send me to the orphanage. I know how this works. The neighbor from the adjacent building told me that he and his sister had been separated. Marina felt her heart clench. I want to go to the orphanage, Dima said. She hesitated, barely believing the words she was about to utter. I want to try to get custody of you, of both of you. Maybe not right away, but eventually. To do that, we have to follow the official process. You understand, don't you? There's no way to cheat the system. He looked at her with piercing clarity, as if he could see through every doubt, every fear, every hesitation. Do you promise? He asked at last. Do you promise that Tima and I will stay together? Marina instinctively wanted to respond with an automatic of course, but she stopped herself. This was a child who had learned to detect adult lies with the precision of a radar. I'll fight for both of you, she said instead. Dima nodded, not with joy, not with relief, just a barely perceptible tilt of his head. Yet Marina felt something shift between them, as if a fragile thread of trust had been spun between them, delicate as a spider's web. The police station smelled of cheap air freshener, unable to mask the staleness of tobacco and sweat. The officer on duty, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, avoided Marina's gaze. I need to file a complaint for neglect and improper care of minors, she said. The officer sighed, as though he had heard this 1,000 times before. Do you have evidence? He asked, drumming his fingers on the desk. Videos? Witnesses? Marina fought to keep her voice steady. The children were alone. Their mother was drunk in the apartment, she said, swallowing back the memory of the stench of decay and filth. The conditions were unlivable. And she offered to sell her youngest son. Something in the officer's expression changed. He straightened up and set his pen aside. Wait a minute. Did you say she tried to sell the child? Marina nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Do you have proof? He asked again. Her fingers fumbled in her bag for Svetlana's receipt, but she hesitated to take it out. It happened in front of me. I can testify. The officer exhaled, this time with a different kind of weariness. Let me call a detective to take your statement. He reached for the phone. We'll need to visit the home. If your claims check out, the children will be removed and placed under temporary guardianship. Noticing Marina's tension, he added, it's only until the court makes a decision. And if Marina's fingers clenched under the table, willing herself to stop trembling. I want to apply for guardianship. The officer's expression hardened with skepticism. Are you a relative? No. He sighed. Then it's complicated. Usually, children are placed in state care before guardianship is arranged. It's a long process, especially for outsiders. But you can consult the child welfare authorities. His words were a stream of standardized phrases, masking the relentless bureaucratic machinery she was about to face. Marina felt the fragile hope she had only just begun to nurture start to wither. The next days blurred into a feverish kaleidoscope of procedures, the children's removal, medical examinations. Dima clung to Marina's hand, while she handed Artyom over to the welfare officer with a wrenching sensation, as if a piece of her heart had been torn away. The doctors found that Artyom suffered from anemia and rickets. They muttered about developmental delays typical of malnutrition. As for Dima, he had early signs of gastritis, multiple parasitic infections, and Marina's stomach twisted, cracked ribs. Old injuries. A history of silent suffering. Dima denied it all. Marina stood behind the glass door of the medical room, watching as Dima was examined, and felt a searing pain, as if every scar on his body had been etched onto her own. Svetlana had been detained but was later released on her own recognizance. In the interrogation video shown to Marina, Svetlana appeared bewildered, as though she couldn't comprehend what was happening. What children? What children? Oh, those children. Her voice was dismissive. Yes, I drank sometimes, but who doesn't? That older one, he's lying. He just wants revenge because I was strict with him. The trial began. Marina sat through each session with a rigid posture and pressed lips, afraid that any excessive reaction might harm the case. Yet inside her, a storm raged. Beyond the transparent walls of the courtroom, life continued. She went to work, trying to keep herself afloat, and visited the orphanage where the boys had been temporarily placed. She brought toys, books, and clothes for Dima, slowly warming the once cold space with her presence. Sometimes, he even smiled, fleeting glimpses of sunshine breaking through the overcast warm sky. "When are we going home?" he asked one day. And the way he said home felt like a promise, like a vow. Marina could only hold him, unwilling to make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She applied for guardianship, but the response from the authorities was lukewarm at best. A single woman with no experience in motherhood, a small apartment, an average income, requesting custody of 2 children at once, one of whom was an infant with medical complications. "This is a serious responsibility," the inspector reminded her, a woman with dull hair and a sharp, scrutinizing gaze over the rim of her glasses. "Financially, emotionally, we have to prioritize the children's best interests." As if Marina didn't think about that every second of every day. As if she didn't wake up in a cold sweat from nightmares where Dima called for her, trapped in an orphanage she could never reach through endless, winding corridors. "I'll manage," Marina said, meeting the inspector's eyes. "I love them. I'll do whatever it takes to make them happy." "Love?" The inspector's tone was almost dismissive. "Stable income. A complete family. Children need a father." As if Dima and Artyom's father hadn't abandoned them. As if Svetlana hadn't tried to sell her youngest son for a bottle of vodka. As if any of that could guarantee a happy childhood. The court rendered its verdict. Svetlana was stripped of her parental rights and given a 5-year suspended sentence for child abuse. She appeared not remorseful, but affronted, as though she were being punished for jaywalking rather than for destroying the lives of 2 innocent children. When the judge asked if she had anything to say in her defense, she uttered a phrase that would haunt Marina's sleepless nights. "Who needs them? Children are just a burden to everyone." In that moment, Marina understood something profound. Svetlana hadn't just lost her humanity, she had lost the very essence of motherhood, the ability to see children not as a burden but as a gift. And perhaps blaming her was as futile as blaming a patient in a psychiatric ward for being colorblind. The custody process dragged on endlessly, thick and sluggish as sour cream. Marina gathered documents, underwent evaluations, spoke to psychologists, and spent nights poring over legal codes, searching for any loophole that might accelerate the process. Day after day, she had to prove her worth as a potential guardian. "You're alone," they reminded her repeatedly, as if chanting a mantra. "Without a man, you're incomplete." "I'll be fine," she replied through clenched teeth, grinding them so tightly that her jaw ached. She took on a second job editing texts remotely, saving every penny she could. She started renovating the small room that was meant to be the nursery. At night, she painted the walls and assembled furniture bought from a budget store. Everything to prove that she had the strength, the means, and the unwavering resolve to give her children a home. One day, as yet another rejection loomed over her, Marina found herself drowning in despair. But this time, she couldn't remain silent. She didn't raise her voice, yet there was a steely resolve in it that made the inspector glance up from her paperwork. "I was married to a man from a wealthy family," Marina began. "He had money, influence, connections. And guess what? The moment he found out I couldn't have children, he left, ran off to someone else who could. Is that your idea of an ideal father? A man for whom commitment is meaningless?" She took a breath, her cheeks burning with emotion. There was a father. Where is he now? Why didn't he take his children away from their drunken mother? Why was an 8-year-old forced to care for an infant? So don't lecture me about the necessity of a complete family. I know what loyalty is. I know what love without conditions looks like. And I am ready to give these children everything I have. Silence settled over the room. The inspector regarded her for a long moment, assessing her. "You'll need a character reference from your employer," she finally said. "And a certificate of income for the last 6 months, including any part-time jobs." It wasn't an agreement, not even a promise, but it was a crack in the wall. Marina left the office on shaky legs, feeling drained, yet within her, hope flickered, fragile as a candle in the wind, but stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. During one of her visits to the orphanage, Dima looked up at her, his voice hesitant. "Do you really want to take us back with you?" They sat in a small room, the orphanage's dull walls pressing in around them. The boy, so thin and weary beyond his years, searched her face, as if bracing for disappointment. But she knew he didn't need long-winded explanations, only the simple truth. "Because I love you," Marina said softly. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "And because we're good together, aren't we?" Dima studied her for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Good," he whispered. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to be held. Two lonely souls who had found each other in the chaos of life. 4 months later, Marina stood in the judge's chambers, custody papers in hand. Beside her, Dima shifted awkwardly on his feet, while Artyom slept soundly in her arms. "Temporary guardianship has been granted for 6 months, the judge, a tired-looking woman with sharp, attentive eyes, announced. "After that, a second panel will review for permanent adoption." Marina nodded, unable to trust her own voice, still struggling to believe this moment was real. Then the judge turned to Dima. "Do you agree to live with Marina Alexeyevna?" The boy lifted his gaze, hope and lingering fear mingling in his eyes. "Yes," he said firmly. "I want to live with her. And with Tima too. She's good." That single word, spoken by a child who had endured so much pain, was worth more than any accolade in the world. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight was blinding, almost as if the universe itself had decided to celebrate with them. Marina felt weightless, as though part of the burden she had carried for so long had suddenly lifted. She turned to Dima, her heart full. "Come on, Dim, let's go home." He nodded, gripping her hand tightly. And so they walked down the street, a woman with a baby in her arms and a boy who had seen too much hardship but now carried something new in his gaze, a fragile, tentative hope. They might never be an ordinary family. Perhaps they never had been. But they were together. And that was all that mattered. A new chapter of their lives was beginning, filled with fears and uncertainties, financial struggles, and domestic challenges, but also with moments of joy and inevitable disagreements. It was a chapter in which 3 lonely souls would learn what it meant to be a family. Marina knew it wouldn't be easy, Dima wouldn't trust her overnight, and Artyom faced years of treatment and rehabilitation. Her own strength and resources might not be enough, but she was ready to fight. For them, for herself, for their shared future. She had once been betrayed and left alone with nothing but emptiness. She wouldn't let that happen to the boys. She would see it through, no matter how difficult the road ahead. "We'll get through this," she said, unsure if she was trying to convince Dima or herself. And for the first time in a long while, she truly believed it. The first weeks felt like walking through a minefield. Marina had never been a mother before and constantly questioned whether she was doing things right, whether she was too strict or too lenient, whether she had found the right balance between discipline and freedom, between care and the need to teach them independence. Dima was guarded at first, wary of small gestures of kindness as if they were a trap. He woke up before dawn, made his bed with the precision of a soldier, and sought to help with everything, from washing dishes to rocking Artyom. "You don't have to work like an adult," Marina told him one evening, noticing how he hurried to wipe the floor after Artyom spilled his juice. "You're a child. Your job is to go to school, to play, to rest." Dima looked at her, confusion flickering into fear, as if she were offering him something forbidden, something dangerous. "I have to help," he insisted. But he left the sentence unfinished. Marina understood the rest. "Otherwise, you will send me back." That unspoken fear haunted him in those early months. The fear that if he wasn't useful enough, he would be cast aside. Artyom adapted more easily. At his age, memories didn't hold the past as tightly. He reached for her without hesitation, smiled at her with a toothless grin, and learned his first words. "Ma," he called her, not yet grasping the full meaning of the word, but already filling it with boundless trust. But with Dima, it would take time. Like peeling layers from an onion, Marina had to strip away his mistrust, his fear, his ingrained belief that love had to be earned through labor. She had chosen his school carefully, a small institution with good reviews and a psychologist specializing in children like him. Though Dima was old enough for the 3rd grade, he was placed in the 2nd due to gaps in his education from years of instability. "He's very bright," said his teacher, Anna Pavlovna, a woman with kind eyes and a talent for reaching even the most withdrawn students. "But he barely interacts with his classmates." Marina saw it too. Dima sat alone in the cafeteria, eating quickly as if afraid the food would be taken away. During recess, he stood against the wall, watching the other children play but never joining in. At night, he often woke up screaming, thrashing in his bed, crying out words Marina couldn't understand. She never rushed to touch him when it happened. He flinched at sudden contact. Instead, she sat beside him and whispered, "It's all right. You're safe. It was just a dream." Little by little, day by day, drop by drop, progress came. The first real breakthrough happened 6 months after the children moved in with her. It was an ordinary evening. Marina sat with her laptop, working on a client's text, while Dima completed his homework at the table. In the crib, Artyom was already fast asleep. Then, suddenly, Dima lifted his head from his notebook. "Are you really not going to send us back?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but the weight of his question filled the room. "You're really not going to send us back?" The question came so suddenly that Marina froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Never," she answered firmly. "You're my children. I love you." She braced herself for another doubtful glance, but instead, Dima smiled, genuinely, for the first time in her memory. His whole face lit up. "I know," he said. And in those two simple words, there was such certainty that Marina felt a lump rise in her throat. That evening, for the first time, Dima sat beside her on the couch of his own accord, leaning into her, allowing himself to be held. She watched as her children blossomed, like plants finally receiving sunlight and water after a long drought. Dima began to change. At first, the differences were subtle, almost imperceptible, but soon they became undeniable. He no longer flinched at sudden noises. He started sleeping more soundly. He learned to laugh, first softly, then with full, infectious joy that suited his face so well. At school, he changed too. He began raising his hand in class, even if he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. He stopped avoiding eye contact with adults. And he made a friend, Kostya, a freckled boy from the neighboring building, a fellow fan of model kits and science fiction. One afternoon, Dima burst through the door, eyes shining with excitement. "We're having a relay race," he announced breathlessly. "I'm running for our class." "That's wonderful." Marina hugged him, feeling his heart racing against her own. "I'll be there to cheer you on." That day, standing in the school stadium among the other parents, she watched Dima run, his whole body stretching forward, his cheeks flushed with effort, his eyes locked on the finish line. He wasn't the fastest, he finished third. But when he turned toward the stands, searching for her, Marina felt a pride so overwhelming it stole her breath. That night, they celebrated over dinner, Dima recounting every moment of the race with such enthusiasm that even little Artyom, though too young to understand much, listened wide-eyed. "The gym teacher said I could join the team," Dima blurted out suddenly, his voice laced with hope. "There's a cycling club in our neighborhood. He says I have potential." Marina hesitated. A club meant extra expenses, fees, possibly a special bike. Their budget was already stretched thin, calculated to the last penny, even with child support and foster care stipends. But the way Dima's eyes gleamed with anticipation, the way he leaned forward, waiting for her answer, how could she say no? "Of course," she said, already recalculating in her mind, searching for ways to make it work. Dima beamed. "Thank you, Mom." It was the first time. Not Marina, the distant, neutral name he usually used. Not the impersonal address he had clung to for so long. Just Mom. A single word that changed everything. Their first Christmas together was special for all three of them. Marina bought a small tree, decorated the apartment with garlands, and they spent the evening making dumplings. Later, wrapped in blankets, they watched old holiday movies while Artyom, now a year old, sat on the carpet, enthralled by a colorful stacking toy Marina had given him. "In my childhood," Dima murmured suddenly, watching his little brother, "our mother was good too." Sometimes. Marina held her breath. Dima almost never spoke about the past. On holidays, when she wasn't drinking, she used to make pancakes, he continued, his gaze still on Artyom. And she sang songs. He paused. She had a beautiful voice. When she was sober, his face would suddenly wrinkle as if in pain. Then her friend, Uncle Vitya, would come over, and they would drink. After that, everything would turn bad again. Marina gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You know, she said softly, it's normal to miss the good moments with your mom. It's not a betrayal. You can remember the good times and still feel sad that they're over. Dima clenched his fists. I don't ever want to go back there. I want to be here, with you and Tima. Always. You will be, Marina assured him, pulling him into a hug. His small body trembled with restrained emotion. That night, for the first time, Dima didn't lock his bedroom door, a small gesture of trust that spoke louder than 1,000 words. As months turned into years, their lives found a steady rhythm, woven with a quiet warmth. Dima blossomed like a flower, revealing new sides of himself each day. He excelled not only in sports but also in the exact sciences. His teacher often praised his sharp, logical mind, yet his greatest passion remained cycling. After that first conversation in the kitchen, Marina had found an affordable municipal training program run by an old-school coach who valued talent over expensive equipment. Dima trained with the unwavering dedication of a child who had found his calling, waking at dawn for exercises, meticulously following his coach's nutritional advice. At first, the coach had been skeptical of the thin, unremarkable boy, but soon he changed his mind. He has character, he told Marina after one training session. And in cycling, that's more important than anything. At his first competition, Dima placed somewhere in the middle. At the second, he inched closer to the leaders. By the end of his second year of training, he won his first bronze medal at the city's junior championship. For you, he said simply, handing Marina the medal. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have finished. But he didn't need to say it. Marina understood. If it weren't for her, he would never have known what it felt like to win. To be an ordinary boy whose worries revolved around school and training, not survival. We'll hang it in the best spot, she said, kissing the top of his head. That medal was the first of many. Year after year, Dima's results improved. His photo, grinning, holding a trophy, eventually made its way onto the school's Our Pride wall. Meanwhile, Artyom was growing into a healthy, happy child, untouched by the shadows of neglect that doctors had once feared. His days at kindergarten were filled with endless discoveries. He would come home with drawings, stories about his friends, and new songs he had learned. Unlike Dima, for Artyom, Marina had always been mom, the only mother he knew. He would cling to her with the tenderness of a child who had never doubted his place in the world, climbing onto her lap while she worked, falling asleep nestled against her. On their third anniversary together, Marina decided to throw a small party. She invited Dima's friends from school and his cycling team to celebrate at a cafe near their home. As she watched her sons, because that's what they were to her now, without hesitation or doubt, she could hardly believe they were the same boys she had met 3 years ago. Dima, now 11, had grown stronger. His wiry frame bore the mark of constant training, his sun-bleached hair gleamed a golden wheat color, and his once wary gray eyes now radiated quiet confidence. He no longer flinched at loud noises. He no longer hoarded food for fear of scarcity. He no longer woke up every night from nightmares. For the first time, he was simply a boy. Artyom, a robust and rosy-cheeked boy with a tousle of auburn curls, bore no resemblance to the frail, undernourished infant wrapped in a tattered blanket. He had grown into a sociable and affectionate child. Whenever Marina picked him up from school, she often heard comments like, "Such a cheerful boy, you'd never guess he came from a troubled background." And they were right. The past was gradually fading, becoming nothing more than a distant, hazy memory, one of those nightmares from which you wake with immense relief. They were happy, not in an extravagant way, but in the way of those who have endured hardship and learned to cherish life's simplest pleasures. Their modest apartment, lovingly renovated over time, the walls adorned with children's drawings, the refrigerator covered with a growing collection of model ships, each meticulously assembled by Dima with the patience of a true craftsman. Financially, they still had to count every penny. Marina's salary as an editor, supplemented by the children's allowance, was enough to keep them afloat but left little room for luxuries. Dima's passion for cycling demanded increasing investment as he advanced to higher levels of competition. Occasionally, charitable foundations supporting gifted children provided assistance, but Marina wanted more, not just for herself, but for the boys. Since childhood, she had loved creating things with her hands. She used to sew dolls and invent elaborate backstories for them. But as life took its course, that passion was left behind. One day, while sorting through old belongings, she stumbled upon a box filled with scraps of fabric, thread, and buttons. Artem, drawn to the bright colors, eagerly rummaged through the materials. Inspired by the moment, Marina quickly sewed him a simple plush rabbit with a squeaky toy inside. Artem was thrilled and refused to part with it, even sleeping with it in his arms. When a mother at his kindergarten noticed the toy, she asked Marina to make one for her daughter. That first request led to a second, then a third. Soon, Marina found herself sewing in the evenings after work, once the children were asleep. At first, she crafted simple toys, but over time, she began incorporating intricate details, giving each one a unique character and story. What started as a small endeavor became not only a source of additional income, but also a rekindling of the creative joy she had long missed. On their third anniversary, the same day they celebrated in a small cafe, Marina made an important announcement. "I have news," she said, once the cake had been eaten and the gifts unwrapped. "I've found a workshop space." Dima raised an eyebrow in surprise. "A workshop? For my toys," Marina explained with a smile. "It's a little room in the next block, a former sewing shop. I'll be able to hold workshops there. I'm starting my own business." Dima's face lit up with genuine happiness. "That's amazing," he exclaimed. In his eyes, Marina saw not just excitement but also a deep, sincere pride in her. "You've been dreaming about this for so long," he added. She nodded. As a child, she had longed to create toys. But life had taken a different path. Now, as she looked at her sons, she realized something profound. "Thanks to you," she said softly, "I've learned it's never too late to chase a dream." Artyom, not fully grasping the depth of her words, clapped his hands enthusiastically. "Mommy's dolls will have their own home," he announced. Everyone laughed, and in that moment, Marina felt tears welling in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming sense of fulfillment and gratitude. Once, life had taken much from her, but in return, it had given her something priceless. A month later, the workshop opened, small and cozy, with large windows and spacious tables for classes. Marina named it Family Stories, inspired by the tales she told her sons, each toy imbued with a unique biography, complete with personality and quirks. She continued working as an editor, though not full-time, dedicating part of her days to crafting simple toys by hand. Adults commissioned bespoke gifts for their loved ones, and several stores agreed to carry her creations. Evenings were spent returning home, where the boys eagerly awaited her, Dima after his training, and Artyom after kindergarten. Marina felt truly happy, as if her life had finally come full circle. Sunday morning unfolded in a familiar rhythm of household rituals. Artyom, now almost 4, took his role seriously, helping to set the table with a concentrated expression, carefully arranging the spoons in a pattern only he understood. Dima, meanwhile, packed his backpack for the next day's training, methodically folding his uniform to avoid a single crease. Sunlight streamed through the loosely drawn curtains, casting warm patterns on the kitchen walls. "After breakfast, we'll go to the supermarket to get groceries for the week," Marina announced, stirring pancake batter in a large bowl. Dima appeared in the doorway, holding a neatly written list. "I made a list of everything we need," he said with quiet pride, handing it to her. "I even included a section for the workshop and the threads you asked for." Marina took the list, her heart swelling with tenderness. This was the same boy who had once been willing to give his little brother away to strangers. Now, he was a thoughtful and organized helper, remembering even the small details she sometimes forgot. "You're a treasure," she said, ruffling his hair affectionately. Dima, now old enough to feel a little embarrassed by such gestures, but still young enough to secretly enjoy them, allowed it with a shy smile. Marina noticed, for what felt like the 1000th time, how his smile had changed over the years, from wary to reserved, and now, to something softer, more open. The bruises were long gone. He no longer looked fragile or guarded, but carried the quiet confidence of a child who knew, beyond any doubt, that he was loved. Breakfast passed in a warm, familiar rhythm of conversation. Artyom eagerly recounted a dream in which he soared through the sky like a superhero, red cape billowing behind him. Dima reflected on yesterday's training, detailing the coach's strategy for the upcoming competitions. Marina listened, occasionally interjecting with a question or a remark, feeling, perhaps more than ever, like the heart of a small, cherished universe that had once seemed unattainable. Later, they gathered their things and headed to a large supermarket on the outskirts of the city, where prices were lower and selections broader, an important factor for their modest budget. The store buzzed with the usual Sunday afternoon crowds. Marina moved through the aisles, checking items off the list. Artyom, tired from the long walk, sat nestled among grocery bags in the shopping cart, occasionally requesting a treat. Dima walked beside them, carefully ensuring they hadn't forgotten anything, his quiet diligence a reflection of the thoughtful young man he was becoming. Marina's cart suddenly collided with another. She looked up to apologize but froze, as if hitting an invisible wall. Standing opposite her, just as startled, was Andre, her ex-husband. Time had changed him. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and fine wrinkles had appeared at his temples and near his eyes. Yet, he remained handsome, carrying the self-assured aura of a successful man. After a brief silence, he finally spoke. What a surprise! His voice, so familiar, yet strangely distant, stirred memories she had long buried. Andre, she acknowledged, nodding, an unexpected calm settling over her. It's been a long time. At that moment, Artyom, restless from sitting in the cart, tugged at her. Mom, I want to get down. She lifted him and placed him beside her, holding his small hand. Dima stepped closer, his posture subtly tense, his usual reaction to unfamiliar adults. Andrei's gaze shifted between the two boys, his expression betraying open astonishment. Marina, you have children? His voice was a mix of disbelief and something else, something closer to confusion. She felt Dima lean against her ever so slightly, his silent way of offering support. His intuition had always been sharp, a survival instinct honed in childhood. Yes, Marina smiled, pulling both boys closer. I've wanted to be a mother for a long time. Now, I have a family. Andre stared at the three of them, struggling to reconcile the woman he had once left, the woman who couldn't bear children, with this confident mother surrounded by her sons. He hesitated before speaking. But, I thought you couldn't. Marina shrugged. Words that once would have cut her deeply now barely grazed the surface. Motherhood doesn't always begin at birth, she replied simply. Sometimes, it begins with a meeting. As if on cue, Artyom tugged at her hand again. Mommy, can I have chocolate milk? The one we always get? Of course, sweetheart. Marina's gaze softened as she looked at him. Dima, will you help him choose? Dima gave Andre one last assessing glance before taking his brother's hand and leading him toward the refrigerated section, never letting Marina out of his sight. Andre cleared his throat. They're adopted? Marina met his gaze without hesitation. They are mine, she said firmly. And I am theirs. That's all that matters. Something shifted in Andrei's expression. A shadow flickered across his face, deepening the lines of age and regret. You? He trailed off, unable to complete his thought. Marina didn't ask. She wouldn't tell him how she had found the boys in the market, how she had fought for the right to be their mother, or how they had built a family out of love and resilience. That story was too sacred to share with the man who had once abandoned her because of a diagnosis. Instead, she changed the subject. And you? How's your family? Andre averted his gaze for a moment, a brief but telling gesture. It's fine. My son is in second grade. My wife, it's complicated. We both work a lot. There was no pride in his voice. No warmth. Marina had expected him to glow with joy at the life he had once envisioned. Children running through a spacious house, a perfect family. But the man before her radiated something else entirely, fatigue, a quiet discontent he might not even recognize within himself. Before the silence could stretch, the boys returned. Artyom beamed as he held up a bottle of chocolate milk. I found it myself. Dima only told me where to look. Marina smiled, her heart full. Andre simply watched. Well done, sunshine. Marina smiled and gently ruffled Artyom's hair. Put the cart back, and let's keep going. We still have a lot to do today, she said, then turned to Andre. It was nice running into you. Say hello to your parents for me. Yeah, sure, he nodded, still watching the boys with a peculiar expression. "It was nice seeing you." Marina took Artyom's hand, with Dima walking on her other side, and they moved forward, leaving Andrei standing in the middle of the aisle. His cart held only a lone bottle of expensive wine and a pack of steaks. She could feel his gaze following them, but she didn't look back. The past was behind her, and she had no desire, even for a moment, to return to the version of herself that had once been insecure, dependent on others' approval. Even before she said anything, Dima nodded, displaying an understanding that sometimes surprised her in an 11-year-old. He said. Artyom, seemingly engrossed in his chocolate milk, suddenly spoke up. Marina glanced at him, intrigued. "Why do you think that?" "He has the same look Uncle Misha had when he told us his cat ran away," Artyom explained seriously, referring to a neighbor who had recently lost his beloved pet. "Like he lost something and can't find it." Marina didn't respond. She just kept walking, marveling at the child's perceptiveness. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought as they continued through the store. That evening, after the children were asleep, Marina sat in her small workshop, finishing an order, a wooden toy knife for a client's son. Her hands moved automatically, shaping and stitching, but her thoughts drifted back to her unexpected encounter with Andrei. 3 years ago, at the start of the adoption process, she had often wondered what he would think if he saw her with the children. She had imagined his shock, perhaps even regret. Back then, such thoughts had fueled a quiet revenge fantasy that helped her endure the struggles, adjusting to motherhood, battling bureaucracy, overcoming financial hurdles. But today, standing face to face with him, she had felt nothing but quiet compassion. Andrei had everything he once longed for, a biological son. Yet something in his demeanor suggested that the life he built wasn't quite what he had envisioned. Maybe his parents, whose opinions had always weighed heavily on him, had proven too overbearing. Maybe the woman he had left Marina for wasn't the perfect partner he had believed her to be. Marina didn't know the answers, and, surprisingly, she no longer cared. She carefully sewed the final piece onto the knight's cloak. The little warrior faced the world with his brave, button-eyed gaze, ready to protect the one who would love him. Marina smiled to herself. She, too, was a kind of knight. She had fought for her children, persevered through every hardship, and won the most important battle of all, the fight for happiness. Through loneliness and rejection, through bureaucratic nightmares and financial struggles, she had found the family she had always dreamed of, not the one she had once imagined, married to a man from a respectable family, living in a grand house, raising biological children who looked like her. Fate had led her somewhere else. To 2 boys who needed her just as much as she needed them. To a small apartment that had become a real home. The apartment had become a true home, filled with warmth, love, and the fulfillment of a job that not only provided an income but also sparked her creativity. Marina set her work aside and gazed out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, each one illuminating a home, a story, a life shaped by triumphs and hardships. She wondered how her own fate might have unfolded had she not been at the market that day, a question that would forever remain unanswered. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Fate chooses us, but we decide what to do with it. Fate had placed 2 boys in her path, children in desperate need of a mother, and she had chosen to become one. Against all odds, fears, and obstacles, she had embraced them. Now, 3 years later, as she looked at her sons peacefully sleeping in their beds, she knew with certainty that it had been the best decision of her life, the only right one. Marina caught her reflection in the dark windowpane. The woman staring back at her was no longer the uncertain, abandoned wife, cast aside for her inability to bear children. She was a mother, the owner of a small but thriving workshop, and a woman who had found her place in the world. Somewhere in the city, Andrei was trying to build a family according to the blueprint inherited from his parents. Somewhere, Svetlana was living her own life, perhaps never even thinking of the children she had lost through her own choices. But here, in this apartment, at this very moment, was Marina, with her children, her family, her happiness. A happiness that was real. A happiness that was infinitely precious. She walked quietly down the hall and peeked into Dima's room. He was sound asleep, a book resting beside him, abandoned mid-read. She checked on Artyom next. He, too, was lost in slumber, clutching the teddy bear she had made for his birthday. Life doesn't always give us what we ask for. Sometimes, it gives us something greater if we have the courage to accept it. Marina had found that courage. And now, as she gently closed the doors to her children's rooms, she silently thanked fate for that cold October day at the market. The day a skinny boy with serious eyes tugged at her sleeve and altered the course of 3 lives forever. And what would you have done in Marina's place that day? Would you have walked past 2 desperate children? Would you have risked everything for the sake of a forgotten promise? Would you have found the strength to fight against bureaucracy, prejudice, and your own fears? Or perhaps you see yourself in Dima, the child forced to grow up too soon, too afraid to trust, to hope, to ask. And the boy who, in a moment of desperation, dared to reach out to a stranger to save his brother. Our most defining moments come at life's crossroads, when the familiar path meets the unknown, offering a chance to step towards something greater. What part of Marina's story moved you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, give it a like. Share it with your friends. Perhaps it will offer strength to someone facing their own struggles or help them see the light at the end of their tunnel. Life doesn't always give us what we ask for. Sometimes, it gives us something greater if we have the courage to accept it. Marina's journey was not easy, but it led her to a love deeper than she ever imagined. What would you have done in her place? Would you have walked past those 2 lost children, or would you have risked everything to change their fate, and your own? Our choices define who we become. We all stand at crossroads where the familiar path meets the unknown. Which road would you take? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. Leave a comment. What part of Marina's journey resonated with you the most? Maybe, just maybe, her story will help someone find their own light in the darkness.